Something bad about every US state, in no particular order. Hawaii is our most recent state added to the Big 50 in 1959. The US government had their eyeballs all over the little group of islands as a strategic military outpost in the 1800s. Not to mention the sugarcane plantations. Freedom forbid any smelly European or Asian countries get their grubby paws on it, so with that in mind, as well as wanting to circumvent any potential sugar tariffs, a couple of US businessmen with a couple of US Marines pointed a couple of their US guns at Hawaiian King Kalakaua in 1887, forcing him to sign over power to the United States. But after the king kame'd his last hame, his sister, Queen Liliuokalani, tried to regain power, but the US was all, ha! So one cuckoo kachu later, and the Republic of Hawaii was established in 1894, led by one Sanford Dole, whose cousin would go on to form the Hawaiian Pineapple Company, which would later become the Dole Food Company. If you've never had it, Dole Whip is freaking amazing. Highly recommend it. Ground zero for the 1918 influenza pandemic, the deadliest pandemic of the modern world, is widely believed to have been Camp Funston in Manhattan, Kansas. The camp itself was an army base training infantry in the closing months of World War I. Well, with failure to quarantine sick troops, the flu was definitely not just in Kansas anymore. Sickly soldiers were sent overseas where they oversneezed in Europe, spreading the flu worldwide. By the end of the pandemic around 1921, roughly 500 million people around the globe had been infected, with death toll estimates ranging from 50 to 100 million poor souls. July 16, 1945 saw the detonation of the world's first nuclear weapon at the Trinity nuclear testing site in the Jornada del Muerto desert in New Mexico. The successful detonation was the catalyst for the construction of the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan towards the end of World War II. It's just a shame that thousands of New Mexico locals were never warned about the testing because they caught some heavy radiation dosages. Between the years of 1948 and 1975, the Aberdeen Proving Ground facility in Aberdeen, Maryland, hosted a wealth of unethical human experiments on US Army soldiers. About 7,000 soldiers were experimented on, all without informed consent, meaning that they had no idea what they were getting into. The men were exposed to over 250 different chemical weapons, including mustard gas, deadly nerve agents, and psychoactive substances for the sake of researching effects, preventative measures, and medical treatments. Despite the lethality of some of these substances, dosages were low enough where no deaths were reported. These are getting dark really quick. So here's a silly one. The Aroostook War of 1838 was a bloodless armed standoff between American and British Canadian lumberjacks. While they slept all night and worked all day, there was a disagreement about where the US-Canadian border actually was. So both sides, eager to chop into the Aroostook River Valley's supple, sappy trees, got into a bit of a kerfuffle. Troops were deployed, but no shots were fired and no lives were lost. Instead, everyone skipped and jumped home to cut down trees on their respective sides. The 1974 super outbreak was one of the most intense tornado outbreaks in recorded history, with 147 separate tornadoes formed in a 25-hour period across 13 states, with Indiana being hit the hardest. 47 fatalities, 1,000 injuries, and hundreds of millions of dollars in damages were reported. That blows. Just slightly west of Virginia is West Virginia, home to the worst mining disaster in the history of the United States, so far. On December 6, 1907, the Fairmont Coal Company's number 6 and number 8 mine shafts in the town of Monongah went kablooey. 2 separate methane explosions instantly killed hundreds of workers in the mines and trapped any of those fortunate enough to survive, but their luck quickly ran out. The combined blast collapsed most of the existing cave structure and the ventilation shaft, blocking off fresh air and building up toxic gases which suffocated the trapped miners. The lack of any safety standards or respiratory safety equipment made rescue attempts hopeless. Only 5 men managed to be saved, with 362 lives lost. The tragedy sparked public outcry for stricter safety standards, and in 1910, the US government established the Bureau of Mines with the goal of reducing mining accidents, though it had been a few decades before any safety standards would be enforced. Bet you don't yearn for the mines anymore, do you? In 1879, members of the Osage Native tribes struck oil on their reservation. The US government did what it does and quickly swooped in to establish oil production and paid out royalties to the members of the Osage tribe, catapulting them to astronomical levels of wealth. And that's when the mysterious deaths started. You see, Congress, not believing that the natives were capable of managing their wealth by themselves, appointed American businessmen and lawyers to look after their finances as legal guardians. Well, throughout the 1920s, some of these guardians began the systematic murder of 60 Osage natives in order to inherit their wealth. Formal investigations were launched, becoming one of the first major investigations conducted by the FBI. If you want to read more about this, I highly recommend the book Killers of the Flower Moon. There was also a film adaptation done recently, but it apparently wasn't as good. Louisiana. In the early 1900s, there was a plethora of invasive water hyacinths just gunking up the local rivers, not to mention a pervasive meat shortage. So in order to feed two birds with one stone, the American Hippo Bill was proposed to Congress. The bill would import African hippos to munch on the plants, only for said hippos to be subsequently munched on by Americans. Other animals were on the list, including Manchurian pigs, African buffalo, Tibetan yaks, rhinos, and of course, dik-diks. Sadly, the bill never passed, thwarting American plans to deep-throat delicious and nutritious dik-dik meat. A series of massive earthquakes completely rocked southeast Missouri in 1811. One 8.0 magnitude earthquake was so severe that it caused sections of the Mississippi River to flow backwards and several parts of the surrounding landscape to go all bleh. Some people died, probably. On April 12, 1861, those gosh dang Confederates bombarded Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina for 34 hours straight and 0 hours gay, marking the start of the United States Civil War, which would go on to claim the lives of nearly 700,000 people. The worst massacre in US history involving a school dates all the way back to 1927 in the small town of Bath, Michigan. Local disgruntled douche Andrew Kehoe used dynamite to destroy the Bath Consolidated School, an expensive upgrade to the local school district. The construction and maintenance of the school caused local property taxes to shoot up to account for operating costs. Kehoe, who was already on edge from his failing farming and political careers, as well as a terminally ill wife, had hit a breaking point with the steeper tax burden. Over the course of several months, Kehoe had managed to purchase multiple crates of dynamite, something typically used in farming at the time for stump and boulder removal, and hid them throughout the school. On the morning of May 18, 1927, the dynamite was detonated, killing 38 in the process and injuring dozens more. While the chaos ensued, Kehoe had murdered his wife, destroyed his own farm, and drove to the school with his truck packed with more dynamite. He parked his car in front of the school and detonated the truck, taking himself and a few bystanders out with him. Luckily though, a second horde of dynamite within the school failed to detonate, preventing further loss of life. This single tragedy had claimed a quarter of the town's children. California, the United States' sweaty ass crack, boasts the largest economy in the country, which is perfect, because that's what they need to constantly fund relief efforts for the thousands of wildfires each year burning millions of acres. In 2020 alone, California saw over 9,600 wildfires with almost 4.4 million acres reduced to char. Do better. Get wetter. Extremely heavy and frequent rainfall in 1926 through 1927 culminated in the Great Mississippi River Flood of 1927. The big ol' river traveled across the land, flooding far and wide through several states including Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, and of course, Mississippi. Around 500 souls were washed away and several hundred thousands of people were displaced from their homes, resulting in upwards of $10 billion in damages. The U.S. Dakota War of 1862 in Minnesota resulted in the largest public execution in United States history. The people of the Dakota Native American tribe were pretty darn pissed as incoming settlers sought to manifest their destiny across the Midwest. After constant displacement and being on the brink of starvation due to poor farming and hunting conditions, the Dakota had just about enough. A small group of Dakota men had attacked and killed 5 settlers, including a man, his wife, and their teenage daughter. This escalated into a small uprising which was stomped out by the US Volunteer Army over the course of about a month and a half. Over 350 US civilians were massacred, with 150 Dakota natives killed in the clash. After all was said and done, 400 Dakota men faced trial with 303 sentenced to death, though President Lincoln did reduce this down to just 38 men sentenced for execution. These men received their short drop and a sudden stop in front of a public crowd on December 26, 1862. Since 2007, over 20 detached and decayed human feet have been washed ashore along the coast of the Salish Sea in northeastern Washington. The feet have been found in various shoes, supposedly protected from additional predation from scavengers. Several of the feet have been identified as remains of missing people or those suspected of ending their own life within the area. Pretty sad, but hey, free shoes. In perhaps the worst lapse of judgment in the history of mankind, the city of Cleveland, Ohio organized Balloon Fest in 1986. The goal of the event was to break a world record of most balloons released simultaneously, but I guess no one realized that balloons don't rise in perpetuity. Shortly after the release of over 1.5 million inflatables, a storm system promptly blew the elastic spheres back to Earth, blanketing the city and polluting Lake Erie. Airplanes were grounded, fishermen went missing, waterways became clogged, and many lawsuits were issued. All in all, the cleanup cost the city of Cleveland over $5 million. The people of Oregon really hate it when you pronounce it as Oregon, so I've experienced. But anyway, a few months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, a single Japanese pilot flew a secret mission to bomb the forests of Oregon in an attempt to divert war supplies. Incendiary bombs were dropped in the forests of Brookings, but in terms of damage, they didn't do jack shit. Thanks! After the war, the Japanese pilot, Nobuo Fujita, was invited back to Brookings as a guest of honor in order to make amends, which he hesitantly accepted. As a formal apology for his actions, Fujita presented the city his family heirloom katana, one passed down across 400 years, which is still on display in the Chetco Public Library to this day. Timothy Treadwell was a huge fan of wild grizzly bears. Keyword being was. He spent about 13 summers living amongst them in Alaska. Returning one final time towards the end of autumn, the bears then became a huge fan of Timothy. One giant grizzly had attacked Timothy and his girlfriend, mauling and eating the couple. The bear was later shot and killed, with an autopsy confirming human remains in its stomach. Fellas, don't befriend giant wild animals. I don't care how cute their ears are. They're wild animals. They will murder you. North Carolina almost became No Carolina in 1961 after a B-52 bomber carrying a payload of 2 nuclear bombs headed towards the Canadian Arctic experienced a catastrophic failure and broke up mid-air shortly after takeoff. The destroyed aircraft unintentionally dropped the bombs back down to Earth, with one falling from the plane as if properly deployed, initiating a sequence of safety switches for detonation. However, one final safety switch failed to actuate, saving North Carolina and a few surrounding states from becoming nothing more than a big black smudge on the globe. The other bomb slammed into the Earth, but very luckily remained intact and relatively undamaged. Both bombs were rated as 3.8 megaton bombs, about 250 times more powerful than those dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. So yeah, the US almost accidentally nuked itself into oblivion. During the events of World War II, tens of thousands of Japanese Americans were relocated to several internment camps across the country out of fear of domestic attacks. One such camp was the Hart Mountain Camp in Park County, Wyoming, which housed 14,000 Japanese Americans during its 3 years of operation between 1942 and 1945. The camp boasted many activities, a poorly supplied school for children, a hospital, and many sports and social clubs, but, you know, they were still forced to be there and heavily monitored. Way back before the US was even established, the English colony of Jamestown, Virginia was formed in 1607. Just a few years later, settlers experienced what is known as the starving time. The combined effects of the brutal winter of 1609, food shortages, devastating disease, and constant Native American attacks really screwed over colonists who resorted to pure desperation for survival. The colonists ate dogs, rats, their own shoes, and each other in order to survive. 300 settlers saw the beginning of winter, but only 60 saw the beginning of spring. The state of Rhode Island saw around 1,000 slaving voyages between the 18th and 19th century, bringing in an estimated 100,000 slaves to the Americas. The year 1919 saw the occurrence of the Elaine Massacre in Hoopsburg, Arkansas. About 100 African American sharecroppers demanded fairer pricing for their cotton crops as they were frequently underpaid for their labors. During a meeting, which was protected by armed guards, 2 white men rolled up to find out what all the hullabaloo was about. After a brief struggle, some shots were fired, though it's unknown who shot first. One of the men died, the other injured. Well, Word got out about the event being a supposed uprising being planned by the black community. In response, several locals and hundreds of US troops were deployed to put an end to the so-called rebellion, resulting in the cold-blooded murder of over 200 African Americans in the area. In 1903, residents of Van Meter, Iowa reported sightings of a strange bat-like humanoid figure for several nights. Dubbed the Van Meter Visitor, the bat-human-dinosaur hybrid monster thing possessed big old flappy wings, sharp claws, and an eerily glowing horn on its melon. Many credible witnesses attest to the sightings, and locals, in true American fashion, shot at the creature in an attempt to kill it. It supposedly escaped into a nearby abandoned mine and was never seen again. In the early 1800s, Colonel William H. Jackson once gifted his favorite oak tree its own deed, legally entitling it to its own ownership and all land within an 8-foot radius of itself. The original tree, located in Athens, Georgia, fell in 1942, but not before an acorn sprouted a new sapling, which legally inherited the land. Why is this bad? That's because there's a chance that this tree owns more land than you do. The Bonneville Salt Flats in northwestern Utah look like something out of a dream sequence. Back in the 1920s, with the evolving technology of automobiles, adrenaline junkies would often challenge each other to travel across the flats as fast as possible. Of course, this inevitably led to numerous crashes, breakdowns, and deaths, a tradition that persists to this day. The Silk Strike of 1913 in Paterson, New Jersey was the organized strike of over 25,000 silk workers with the goal of establishing an 8-hour workday and better working conditions. Over the course of the strike's 5-month duration, 300 silk mills had shut down with no workforce, and over 1,800 strikers were arrested for inciting violence. Ultimately, the strike was defeated as influence failed to spread beyond Paterson and no demands were ever met. Speaking of terrible working conditions, the Radium Girls of Ottawa, Illinois were tasked with hand-painting watches with self-luminous paint made from radioactive powdered radium. The women would often point their brushes with their lips to produce finer tips, but their lips inadvertently sipped the radioactive drips, and if one dared to skip the lip tip grip, their managers would flip, so tips remained dipped and their lips remained zipped. Company owners expressed the safety of the material, but actively avoided it themselves. The ingestion of the radium, unsurprisingly, caused multiple women to contract radiation poisoning. Between the years of 1917 and 1927, over 50 women had died from acute radiation syndrome. This sparked public outrage and reforms in labor rights. Radium continued to be used in the production of watch dials up to the 1970s. Multiple residents outside of Exeter, New Hampshire, all reported seeing the same strange light pattern in the sky across several evenings in 1965. The large object reportedly moved silently across the night sky, emitting eerie red lights in a specific pattern. The event terrified locals in the area for years, though skeptics have debunked this event as simply a mid-air refueling drill performed by the United States Air Force. Specifically, KC-97 tankers flashed red lights in the same exact pattern that was described by eyewitnesses. The city of Wilmington, Delaware experienced a catastrophic outbreak of cholera and typhoid fever in the late 1800s thanks to rapid industrialization shitifying up the local water sources. With hundreds sick and dozens dying, the city had to drastically overhaul the local sewer system, including installing a water purification plant in the early 1900s. But at least you can breathe a fresh sigh of relief nowadays. This is a devil's hole pupfish, a critically endangered and supremely cute species of fish found only in the Devil's Hole in the Death Valley National Park in Nevada. Or Nevada for the locals. The fish were first discovered back in the 1940s and were almost immediately attempted to be protected. In 1967, they were officially listed as endangered thanks to local drilling by development companies, which reduced water levels within the cave system. Despite aggressive conservation efforts, there were only 38 of the little guys in existence as of spring 2025, making them one of the most critically endangered species on Earth. The Great Jacksonville Fire of 1901 completely reshaped the city of Jacksonville, Florida. After a rogue kitchen fire broke out, the flames quickly spread to a nearby mattress factory. After more than 8 hours, the inferno finally came under control after completely engulfing the majority of the city, destroying almost 2,400 buildings in the process, rendering 10,000 people homeless and 7 people dead. Now that's what I call a fire sale. Farmers in the late 1960s and early 1970s were pretty pissed to find their precious moo cows slaughtered and mutilated beyond natural means. Investigations clocked in over 8,000 separate mutilations over the years. Some of the bulbous bovines were found to have sedatives in their systems, while others were secretly marked with fluorescent paint. Unidentified aircraft in the area were spotted, suggesting government interventions or possible secret weapons testing, but no conclusive evidence was ever found. 19th century Philadelphia, Pennsylvania saw the rise of several teeth thieves who would go around robbing graves of entire bodies. The corpses would be sold to nearby medical schools for anatomical study, while the teeth were extracted and sold to companies who made dentures. Remember to smile. Kentucky is home to the McCoy family, one half of the infamous Hatfield-McCoy family feud. Initial squabbles began in the 1870s over the Civil War, with the Hatfields being Confederate sympathizers and the McCoys being pro-Union. Across 30 years, multiple lawsuits, thefts, and even murders escalated the feud, with over a dozen family members killed. The feud finally came to an end in the late 1890s. Or did it? About 100 years after the start of it all, descendants of the families came together to duke it out on the game show Family Feud in 1979, with the McCoys coming out on top. Nowadays, the family homes are tourist attractions, holding annual festivals with activities like tug-of-war and sight tours to commemorate the decades-long dispute. Just north of South Dakota is North Dakota, and boy did it suffer a harsh winter in 1936. Record low temperatures plummeted all the way down to negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That's negative 51 C for you foreigners. The frigid forecast froze farm fauna fleeing for favorable feverishness. Entire towns burned through their coal supplies, leaving families to die in their homes from exposure. In 1847, nearly 200 Dutch immigrants made their way over from the Netherlands to Wisconsin in search of a better life, but a similar cold climate. After months of crossing the Atlantic and scooting in through to the Great Lakes, the freaky-deaky Dutch were just about to set foot in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, when a poorly maintained boiler overheated, causing a fire to erupt on board the very wooden ship. Unfortunately, the ship only had 2 lifeboats, capable of holding about 20 people each. Of the few hundred people aboard, only 45 managed to escape on the lifeboats. The Phoenix, ironically, went down in a blaze, never to rise from the ashes, because they were washed away. Mysterious deaths surrounding the Ray family had caused concern for the townsfolk of Jewett City, Connecticut. The supposedly healthy family members were stricken down left and right from an undetectable killer. The boys of the family became paler by the day and were seen coughing up blood until ultimately passing away within the coming days. The reasonable cause of death, the townsfolk thought, was vampires. In order to stop the undead from rising and killing others, the recently deceased were exhumed from their graves and burned. The real culprit? Tuberculosis. Conveniently enough, though, the burning of the corpses probably did prevent the contagious disease from spreading any further. Go figure. In 1855, the US government approved the import of several camels to serve as pack animals through the arid landscape of the Southwest, formally establishing the United States Camel Corps. But then the Civil War broke out a few years later in 1861, and the camels were either sold off or completely abandoned in the desert, supposedly being spotted over the next several decades. Roam free, fellas. Boston, Massachusetts is home to the deadliest nightclub fire in US history. The Coconut Grove fire burned itself into people's memories in 1942 with a wealth of poor safety choices leading to the brutal blaze. Exit doors were chained up to prevent unauthorized access, air conditioners were filled with flammable refrigerants, and everyone was packed in like sardines. Not to mention the fact that all of the lavish interior decor could catch fire faster than a witch in Salem. In all, 492 people ended up dying in the inferno. The club owner, Barney Walensky, who was very much aware of his club's safety code violations, was convicted on just 19 counts of manslaughter and was sentenced to just 15 years in prison, though he was pardoned after just 4. He ended up dying a few weeks after release from cancer. Now, when you're chilling in class, the last thing you want to experience is a big old gas explosion. But unfortunately, the students in the New London School in New London, Texas, were about to do just that. Alright class, who could tell me what happens when you hook a big chunk of magnesium into some water? Yep, Ron. That's an easy one. It just, after recently canceling their natural gas supply contract to save a few buckaroos, the school board decided to instead tap into a local gasoline waste line to supplement the demand. The shitty and shoddy plumbing work caused natural gas leaks throughout the school's basement crawl spaces. Now keep in mind that natural gas is colorless and odorless, so no one was really aware of any leaks, except for the students who complained of headaches, though they were ignored by the staff.
You get out of here, go on, get.
The creeping gas cloud was inadvertently ignited on March 18, 1937, causing an instantaneous explosion that killed 295 out of roughly 500 students and staff present in the building. The disaster led to a reform of requiring odorous additives to be added to natural gas supplies for better detection of leaks. If you're looking for a breath of fresh air, New York City is probably not the best place to do so, especially in 1966. The Great New York City smog blanketed the Big Apple in a giant fart cloud of carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and smoke. The dense haze persisted for 3 days across the 1966 Thanksgiving weekend. A public health study estimated that about 10% of the city's population suffered some adverse health effects from sucking in the smelly smog. In the end, 168 New Yorkers ended up biting the dust, prompting President Lyndon B. Johnson and several members of Congress to produce the 1967 Air Quality Act and amendments to the 1970 Clean Air Act, which heavily reduced air pollution down to more manageable levels of toxicity. In the wake of the US Civil War, the South was really hurting for some cheap labor as all of their slaves were just freed thanks to the 13th Amendment. The best alternative? Prisoners. Convicts were extremely cheap compared to full-time employees, so in the early 1890s, Coal Creek mine owners decided to lay off their workforce and instead conscripted convicted criminals to work the mines for pennies on the dollar. But instead of milling around, the recently sacked and salty miners decided to pick a fight, sparking the Coal Creek War of 1891. The manic miners attacked a load of state prisons and mining properties, ensuring their efforts would not be in vain. The National Guard was called in, arresting over 500 workers. The scuffle did result in Tennessee ending their convict leasing program in 1896, so that's a win. Sweet Home Alabama is home to Yellow Mama, an electric chair built in 1927 by master carpenter and inmate Ed Mason. 152 criminals have gotten the sweet, stinging embrace of Yellow Mama's arms, with her final zap being performed in 2002. Since then, death row inmates were given the legal right to choose their demise, either lethal injection or the chair, and to no surprise, they opt for the less painful option. As such, Yellow Mama remains locked away in the attic of the Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, patiently waiting for her next victim. Imagine your life as a beaver, munching away on a tree or building a dam, when all of a sudden you get yoinked away from your beaver family, put in a tiny box, flown up to the sky, and hucked out of an airplane to be parachuted down miles away from home. That's exactly what the Idaho Department of Fish and Game did in 1948 after locals complained of excessive property damage. 76 beavers were relocated from northwest Idaho to central Idaho via airdrop using leftover World War II parachutes. One beaver died. Very sad. A big-ass swarm of locusts tore across the Midwest in 1874, devastating any and all vegetation, food, clothes, and farming equipment for days on end, with Nebraska taking most of the damage. Water sources were contaminated and livestock were consumed. High estimates place the swarm size at upwards of 12.5 trillion locusts. I mean, there were quite literally a blanket of locusts a foot high off the ground. The swarm, spanning across 2 million square miles, reportedly blocked out the sun for multiple hours during their flight. By the time the locust plague had passed, the Midwest had sustained over $200 million in crop damages. Bennington Triangle, located across southwestern Vermont, saw several people disappear under mysterious circumstances between 1945 and 1950. The most well-known case being the disappearance of 18-year-old student Paula Jean Weldon, who up and vanished in 1946 and was never seen again. The young girl had reportedly left her college campus in the afternoon and proceeded to walk 6 miles to a nearby trail before going missing. Lack of substantial police investigation, evidence, or witnesses left the case cold. The poorly run investigation had prompted the Vermont legislature to create the Vermont State Police just 7 months after Paula Jean's disappearance. Hundreds of Lakota Sioux natives were gunned down during the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 after natives began expressing frustration and anger over continued forced relocation and broken promises from the US government.
You suck.
A new religious movement called the Ghost Dance, a literal dance performed in hopes of ridding the land of white settlers, was seen as a potential act of rebellion.
That's scary, I don't like that.
As a precaution, natives were rounded up and disarmed by the US Army. A misunderstanding surrounding an accidental misfire of a rifle started the massacre, which saw the murder of about 300 native men, women, and children. Montana is home to one of the most famous archaeological hoaxes of all time, the Cardiff Giant. A quote-unquote petrified man supposedly recovered from a well in 1869 by 2 local workers. The giant hardened human stood at over 10 feet tall and weighed about 3,000 pounds. The giant acted as an attraction to which thousands of tourists flocked for 50 cents a pop, roughly $12 in today's money accounting for inflation. Visitors stood in complete awe at the supposed relic of human history as proof of how giants once roamed the earth. But in reality, the stone statue was just that, a statue. It was created by one George Hull in an attempt to show how easily the public could be fooled by fake artifacts. He constructed the statue and buried it in the aforementioned well, where, a year later, he instructed his unaware workers to dig it up as a genuine artifact.
Well. Shut up. Okay.
After just 2 months of worldwide spectacle, Hull proudly confessed to the hoax as one big gotcha moment, calling everyone a bunch of stupid idiots. Well, there you go. That's something historically bad about every US state. If you want to hear some weird stuff about every country in the world, click this. I'll see you over there.